It's the middle of the American colonial era, a time when English settlements in the New World are no longer in their infancy. But it's far from certain at this point that America will develop into the powerful country it is today. In fact, between political turmoil in England and violent attacks by Native Americans, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, now present-day Massachusetts, is on precarious footing. It's a time of uncertainty and fear, and it's also a time with limited technology, which restricts access to outside knowledge. Many people live their entire lives without leaving the colony. A trip to nearby Boston may be the most exciting bit of travel most people ever get. You might even live and die without ever seeing a non-white person, except maybe for a Native American or foreign-born slave. But this is also a time when a town's sustainability directly relies upon its residents. The vast majority of people don't own slaves, so they perform important labor for the direct benefit of the village. The Massachusetts population is largely homogeneous, with a shared ethnicity, culture, and of course, religion. There's little to no separation of church and state. Religion and government go hand in hand. This extends to broader society as well. Conform to social customs, and you'll be accepted by the church, allowed to make money, and thrive. But if you defy the church, or live in a way that's at odds with what the church teaches, you risk being excommunicated, cut off from society, and cast out into poverty. And this brings us to February 1692. The start of everything going off the rails. After two young girls in the village of Salem suddenly fall into fits, screaming and contorting as if possessed, the floodgates for witchcraft hysteria burst open. A mysterious affliction spreads to other young women around Salem like a virus, and accusations of witchcraft soon follow. One of the first accused witches, an enslaved woman named Tituba, gives an animated confession, admitting to the practice of dark rituals in service of Satan, and names several other Salem locals as fellow witchcraft practitioners. Panic soon takes hold, as neighbor accuses neighbor of casting curses on them. The accused are brought into brutal trials and left to defend themselves. Women's bodies are inspected for birthmarks or moles that are believed to be signs of the devil drinking of their blood. Homes are raided in search of ointment pots, horoscope books, and other possessions that might be linked to dark magic. Over a period of just 15 months, 200 people are accused of witchcraft. 30 are found guilty, and 19 are executed. It's not just women either. 5 men are found guilty and hanged, while another dies from torture, and 5 more people perish while detained in Salem's poorly kept prisons. In the years after the trials, several of Salem's accusers, mainly teenage girls, admit that they'd made up their charges. The enslaved woman Tituba is suspected of faking her confession in order to earn favor with the authorities. Nowadays, the Salem Witch Trials are considered a prime example of a population falling to mass hysteria, resulting in the tragic deaths of over a dozen innocents. So, if there was no actual witchcraft, what really happened in Salem Village? And how could an entire town collectively lose its sanity overnight? The answer might surprise you, because it's actually not that complicated. But before we can unravel the why behind one of the most notable collective panic attacks in human history, we first need to examine the when. The end of the 17th century was a trying time for England's colonies in the New World. Originally established by English royal charter in 1629, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was left with an uncertain future after their original charter was terminated in 1684. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, political turmoil gripped England as the Glorious Revolution replaced the Catholic monarchy with new Protestant rulers, William and Mary. This important historic moment gave greater legitimacy to English Parliament's authority over the crowns. Not long after, in the colonies, continued strife with Native Americans led to waves of attacks along the northeast coast, causing widespread fear and abandonment of entire settlements. Waves of refugees were forced to flee their homes, taking their families and belongings with them. So, between domestic dangers and political upheaval back home, the Massachusetts Bay Colony's future looked rocky at best and doomed at worst. But for Salem, Massachusetts specifically, society was even more unstable. Salem was actually 2 separate settlements, Salem Village and Salem Town. And the 2 Salems had long been quarreling with one another. In 1672, Salem Village voted to break from Salem Town and hire their own ministers. As there was little division of church and state, the role of minister was one of great local authority. But in the years that followed, Salem Village struggled to find a minister who would keep the job long term. Their first 2 hires both left after short terms when their church's congregation failed to pay them fully, and one of them, Reverend George Burroughs, was even arrested later in the witch trials, convicted, and hanged. And within Salem Village itself, the population was known to be polarized and quarrelsome, not unlike the political climate in America today. Neighbors regularly argued about matters such as farming rights, property lines, and individual standing within the church. And for the typical Salem resident, one standing in the church was the difference between being respected as a helpful member of society and being ostracized. Massachusetts had largely been settled by English Puritans, a conservative religious sect who'd split off from the Roman Catholic Church, and the concept of witchcraft was very much alive in their religious beliefs. Magic wasn't about waving a wand and saying funny words like we sometimes envision it today. Magic was inherently tied to the devil. It was evil, unholy, and very much a real threat. The Puritans believed that Satan regularly attempted to take over the souls of the innocent, and that if you failed to resist him, he would use you to cast spells upon the world. A witch or wizard was simply a person who had given in to his temptations and practiced dark magic in his service. When Massachusetts was established in 1630, Governor John Winthrop famously called the colony a city upon a hill, meaning a utopian society meant to serve as an example to the world of how a good Christian settlement should be run. You can probably start to see the problem here. If the successful development of the Massachusetts colony is a divinely inspired task, then anyone or anything that might oppose it can easily be branded a work of evil. To the colonists who believed evil was actively resisting the development of their colony, witches probably seemed about as real a danger as illness does to us today. And the belief that witchcraft was not only possible but prevalent was further fueled by the works of a man named Cotton Mather. Mather was a minister in nearby Boston who wrote and distributed materials regarding his belief in witchcraft. Mather claimed a local Boston family had been plagued by witchcraft after their mother cast spells on her children. 4 out of 6 kids in the household had convulsed into fits, with neck and back pain, loud outbursts, and wild flapping of their arms. Thanks to this publicity, these symptoms quickly became a standard for what witchcraft's effects could look like in its victims, giving the colonists clear red flags to look out for. Of course, this also meant that if someone had dubious intentions, they could mimic the believed effects of witchcraft rather easily. The Puritans also held that women were more vulnerable than men to the devil's temptations. In the book of Genesis, Eve is the first to eat the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden after being tempted by the serpent. Adam follows her example, but it's Eve, the woman, who's initially the guilty party. Women were considered to have weak and vulnerable bodies that were inherently easier for Satan to influence. But as was common throughout Europe, colonial society was also structured patriarchally, with the male governors and reverends holding important positions of influence. Accusing a landowning man of having given into evil temptation raised greater skepticism than a similar accusation against a woman, especially if that woman was already seen as an outsider. So, we've now laid the cultural and temporal groundwork for understanding what Salem was like when witchcraft hysteria took over. But to really pinpoint the why of it all, we need to look at this conflict even more precisely. We need to look at the people themselves. After all, nooses don't kill people, people do. The first 2 victims to fall mysteriously ill in February of 1692 were 11-year-old Abigail Williams and 9-year-old Betty Paris. The 2 girls were cousins and living in the same household at the time. Abigail and Betty reportedly fell into fits, screaming and throwing things around the room. Their symptoms bore similarity to those popularized by Cotton Mather's witchcraft reports. But notably, these 2 girls were the daughter and the niece of Salem's own Reverend, Samuel Paris, the 4th in the recent line of reverends that the village had struggled to retain long-term. After Reverend Paris urged the girls to tell him who was responsible for their fits, Abigail and Betty accused the first of Salem's would-be witches, Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba. Sarah Good already had a negative reputation around Salem for years before the trials, primarily because she had fallen to economic hardship after being cut out of her late father's inheritance. Good had been known to beg for money, but was said to have muttered ungratefully after Reverend Paris had once helped her. The second culprit was Tituba, the slave of none other than Reverend Paris himself. Tituba's origins are a little vague, but it's theorized she had been brought as a slave from the Caribbean. She'd have been an obvious target for blame due to her origins as an outsider and her low social standing. It was even alleged that Tituba may have shared stories of demons and magic with Abigail and Betty that she'd brought with her from her homeland, tempting the girls to convert to evil ways. And of course, Tituba is said to have animatedly confessed to her alleged witchcraft and named other co-conspirators, though she likely only did this out of self-preservation, or possibly even spite against the people who discriminated against her. But the third target might just be the most interesting. Sarah Osborne had already caused a stir around Salem years before she was accused of witchcraft. Through her first marriage, Osborne indirectly married into one of Salem's most prominent families, the Putnams. The Putnams held great sway in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They even had their own coat of arms. But after her husband died, Osborne remarried to their former servant and claimed the family estate for their own. This was despite her late husband's will specifying the estate should pass to his 2 sons. This threw Osborne into shaky legal standing with her children, and likely drew animosity from the executor of her husband's will, the well-known Captain John Putnam, who had also been her husband's brother-in-law. So you can see why this would have been a heated conflict. By defying social norms, Osborne had placed herself in opposition to one of Salem's most influential families. And it may just be a coincidence, but Betty and Abigail were friends with 12-year-old Anne Putnam. Anne herself went on to also claim witchcraft affliction in the following weeks, and is said to have been responsible for a whopping 62 accusations throughout the trials. It's also known that a feud between the Putnam and Porter families was one of the most divisive social issues in Salem at the time. So let's put the big picture together. It's a tense time for a conservative small town already rife with arguments and family feuds. 2 girls suddenly come down with an ailment that only fits the description of those affected by witchcraft. But of course the symptoms match. Why wouldn't they? Both girls likely knew of the effects witchcraft was said to produce because they were living with Reverend Parris at the time, and he, in turn, would have learned the symptoms from his colleague Reverend Mather's writings. To this day, experts still haven't identified a likely medical explanation for the girls' cases, but considering their ages and the personal nature of the accusations, it's highly likely that Abigail Williams and Betty Parris were simply 2 young girls acting out for attention in a society where women had significantly less power than men. And frankly, there probably wasn't much that the girls could do for fun. It's not like they could just go on YouTube and watch Unpopular Science. Abigail and Betty were probably desperate to have some excitement in their lives. And what could be more exciting than a hidden satanic conspiracy right in their very midst involving all the people they had the most cause to dislike? Because the girls didn't just accuse random people. They accused those around them who looked different, or behaved different, or had been rude to them or their father. Take a second and think back to your childhood school days. Who was that teacher that you and your friends loved to hate? She may have been boring or smelled funny or made you read too many books. How often did you let your imagination paint her, not as a person, but as an insufferable old witch, a crone who loved to torment children? It's entirely natural for children and teenagers to let their imaginations exaggerate the vile nature of people they dislike. But for the young women of Salem, their religious beliefs not only told them that they should draw attention to miscreants who defied traditional Puritan values, but that witchcraft was real, and the writings of Cotton Mather claimed it had already been active in nearby Boston. Why wouldn't the girls seriously consider that these non-traditional women who were disliked by their family and friends might be real witches? Sarah Good reportedly had expressed ungratefulness despite Reverend Parris's charity. It doesn't take much imagination to see how the girls might imagine the strange beggar woman who grumbled on their doorstep as a crone who'd want to curse their family. Tituba was an obvious choice, as her father's slave likely would have seemed almost alien, a woman of a strange culture from a different world. In the case of Sarah Osborne, it's quite possible that the girls accused her because their friend, Anne Putnam, had pressured them to do so. After all, Anne went on to make dozens more accusations herself, and the Putnams had plenty of reason to want Osborne out of the picture. Perhaps the evil magic conducted by these women was the reason Salem had failed to retain a long-term minister, or was the reason they'd fallen into so much quarreling and infighting. All the pieces of evidence to support a dark magic conspiracy were right before their eyes, along with the likely culprits. And if somehow these women turned out to not be witches after all, most good Salemites would probably agree the village was better off without them anyway. Puritan religious views condemned jealousy, anger, and personal vengeance. You were told to turn the other cheek against violence and forgive those who sinned against you. But surely if you have reason to suspect your obnoxious neighbor is not just a nuisance, but an active follower of Satan, you should report them to the authorities, right? In a town that was already strife with interpersonal conflict, the advent of a supposed witchcraft epidemic, as first imagined by two preteen girls, gave the people of Salem a weapon. A weapon that not only was legal, but was imperative to use against evildoers according to their own moral code. It was a see something, say something type system. Always safer to report someone who might be friendly with the devil than to leave them be. So after the authorities questioned the three accused and decided that the same evil that had endangered a family in Boston had now come to Salem, the townspeople took little convincing. This wasn't a case of mass hysteria in the slightest. Salem was a pile of dynamite, already rife with land disputes and church controversies, and the only spark that was needed to set it off were two bored girls and an overzealous reverend handing its townspeople the manacles with which to shackle their own neighbors. In a world where anyone could be a witch, you watch your rivals more closely. You bear caution around that neighbor who you've been arguing with about property rights for the last decade. After all, you wouldn't want to give them the chance to curse you when your back is turned. Perhaps you should take a peek through their windows to check for any signs of witchcraft in the works. In doing so, maybe you spot something odd. An old book with a faded cover or a strange pot of herbs on the kitchen table. Is that enough evidence to go to the authorities? If you don't make the accusation first, you risk that same rival accusing you instead. After all, most townspeople in Salem undoubtedly realized how flimsy the initial accusations had been, even if they hadn't spoken out against them. Because criticizing the trials was one of the fastest ways to get yourself thrown right into them. One of the first men who had been accused of witchcraft had done exactly that. So in order to survive, you just had to make sure that anyone who might accuse you, you accused first. And just like that, the match was struck. All the personal vendettas that had been lurking in Salem for years came bubbling to the surface. Families are torn apart. Dozens of innocents are found guilty. And it's all done under the guise of catching witches and protecting the town from evil. Sarah Osborne died in prison on May 10th, 1692. Sarah Good was hanged on July 19th, along with 4 other convicted women. Tituba vanished from history. By June 1693, less than a year and a half since the first accusations, the trials had ended in the wake of growing legal backlash over the lack of concrete evidence being used to determine guilt. But despite their relatively short tenure, for decades after the executions, the families of the victims fought for financial compensation and to clear the names of their loved ones who had been hanged or imprisoned. The Salem Witch Trials today are remembered as a piece of pop culture, ripe with dark magic, conspiracy, and paranoia. But ultimately, the entire conflict was one that is deeply human. It arose out of rivalries in a stressful, uncertain time, stirred on by the imaginations of a town that took little convincing to see evil at work in their midst. Thanks for watching Unpopular Science. We're exploring the hidden side of the world through the lens of social science and cognition. Subscribe for more.